What's up, guys? Corey Hankerson here from Legacy Tax, author of End the Tax Nightmare, Insider Secrets to Beat the IRS and Reduce Your Tax Debt. You know, I hear it all the time. I would pay the tax, but the interest and penalties are killing me. And unfortunately, that's really just the way it is. You see, if given enough time, the interest and penalties that IRS assesses against an unpaid balance have a way of making a $10,000 or $20,000 tax liability just explode into a $50,000 or $100,000 tax nightmare. So what can you do to get the IRS to reduce or remove the penalties and interest assessed on your account? So first, the interest. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do about the interest. You see, by statute, the IRS is required to assess interest against an unpaid tax balance. So they really aren't going to remove the interest, at least not directly. There is a way that you can do it sort of indirectly, and that is by getting them to remove the underlying tax or getting them to remove the penalties. And that's because they add interest onto the tax itself, as well as the interest as well as the penalties that accumulate when the tax itself goes unpaid. So if you can get them to remove the tax or get them to remove the penalties, then the interest that's associated with those items will go away. Okay, so penalties. How do you get them to take off penalties? You have a lot more recourse here with respect to the penalties, right? So there are four different ways to go about doing it. So I'm gonna talk about each one of those four in order, right? The first one is by administrative abatement, right? So an administrative abatement is when the IRS decides to remove or abate a penalty that it has assessed against you, right? One of the most common is what's called the first-time abatement. So a first-time abatement is when a taxpayer who otherwise has a clean history of filing and paying their taxes comes under circumstances that causes them to file or pay late, and as a result of that, they're hit with penalties. Now they're going to look back at your history and see, well, you for 20 years, for example, you filed and paid every single year on time, but it's just the last 2 years or 3 years even that you've run into problems. They will often abate or remove the penalties for those particular years without you having to show good cause. Okay. So that's the first, administrative abatement. The second is removing penalties for good cause. Now, this is a little bit trickier because you have to show good cause, as the name implies, right? So what is good cause? Well, I'll tell you, there aren't very many reasons that the IRS will accept as good cause for removing a penalty. You're talking about things like your house burned down in a fire, you were in a coma in the hospital, your spouse died, something really, really serious, usually having to do with catastrophe or death or serious illness that caused you to not be able to file or pay despite due diligence on your part. In other words, you didn't do anything wrong, but due to things beyond your control, you weren't able to file or weren't able to pay. If you can make that argument, they'll generally remove penalties for good cause or for reasonable cause, as the statute describes it. The third reason is called statutory abatement, right? And what statutory abatement is when the IRS removes a penalty because they have to, because the statute requires them to. So for example, there's a statute on the books that says that the IRS cannot assess a failure to file or failure to pay penalty against a soldier serving in a combat zone. So if you're in the military, you're deployed in a combat zone, they can't assess penalties against you because you filed or paid your taxes late. So if you can show that you fit within those factual circumstances, then they have to remove penalties, and they will. Other examples might be if you live in an area that's declared a natural disaster, maybe because of hurricanes or floods or something like that, and the government declares it to be a disaster area, and that declaration requires that the IRS not assess penalties against you, then you can probably make that factual argument and they'll remove those penalties. But other than that, that's not something that you see very often, right? And the last avenue for seeking penalty abatement is one that you see even less frequently. It's the least frequent of the four, and that is removing penalties because of IRS error. Now, to get penalties abated because of an IRS error, you need to show that the IRS gave you erroneous advice, written erroneous advice. So they could not have just told you something. They have to have written it down, provided to you in writing. It needs to have been erroneous or mistaken. You need to have relied upon it in good faith. So you didn't know it was bad advice because the IRS gave it to you. You thought it was accurate and you relied on it. And your reliance on that advice caused you to either file late or file or pay the wrong form or pay the wrong amount or something like that. It was all their fault. And in that instance, if you can jump all those hurdles and fit within those facts and circumstances, they will abate the penalties. Now, so those are the four avenues for penalty abatement. The question is, how do you know which of those four you fit within? Well, I would invite you to download a free copy of my book, End the Tax Nightmare: Insider Secrets to Beat the IRS and Reduce Your Tax Debt. You can get a copy of the book for free by going to www.endthetaxnightmare.com. There's a link to the website below in the description. You can download the book for free. There's a whole chapter on IRS penalties and interest. All right, that's it for today, guys. Thanks for checking out this video. Talk to you later.